In 1965, I lost 3 colleagues in an accident in the Totten Fiella from Halley Bay. Jeremy Bailey, Di Wilde, and John Wilson. I discovered that 28 men and 1 woman had died, all the men between 1944 and 1984, and felt that we had to create some kind of monument to them. And I conceived of the idea with the sculptor Oliver Barrett of having a monument which is in 2 parts. One part in the northern hemisphere, somewhere in the Britain, and the other in the southern hemisphere, perhaps in the Antarctic, perhaps in the Falkland Islands.
Like all extraordinary events, it happened by complete chance. I'd recently come back from installing a memorial on Mount Everest, which was a memorial to all the climbers who had died attempting the ascent of Everest. And sitting on a bench, minding my own business, looking at the sculpture, a large and effusive man came and sat down next to me, which happened to be Rod, and he said, "I hear you make sculptural memorials." And I said, "Well, of course I do, yes." And told him the story of the Everest project. And he said, "Well, I'd like you to do one for us." And he told me about his involvement in the Antarctic and the friends of his who had died while he was working out there. And I was completely captivated. So having sort of thought about this idea of loss and the importance of exploration and the relationship between one place, a sort of mother country, and the place that was being explored and investigated, I thought really that we should stretch the idea of what a memorial is into, rather than a single object, turning it into a piece of work which spans the globe and has a presence both here in England, in Cambridge, and also down in the Southern Ocean, in the southern frozen world.
When the British Antarctic Monument Trust came to me and suggested that their memorial might be located in the grounds of the Scott Polar Research Institute, I thought that this was an excellent idea. The reason for that was twofold. The first is because the Scott Polar Research Institute is itself a national memorial to Scott and his 4 companions, Wilson, Bowers, Oates and Evans, who died on their return from the South Pole in 1912. The second is because Cambridge is very much the centre of polar research in the UK and was augmented greatly by the location of the British Antarctic Survey in Cambridge from the 1970s. So in that context, a monument to those who have died in the pursuit of science in Antarctica over the last 80 or so years in the grounds of the Institute seemed to me to be extremely appropriate. The gardens of the Institute already contain 2 sculptures by Kathleen Scott. One is above the front door to the Institute. That is a bust of her late husband, Captain Scott, created in about 1920. The second is a separate statue close by the one for the Memorial Trust, which is called Youth. And I think that expresses very well and complements the memorial for the Antarctic Trust, because most of the people who died in Antarctica were actually young people in the prime of life, and Youth commemorates this too.
This is a photograph of my brother Jeremy. It was taken on the day he arrived at Halley Bay in Antarctica. It forms part of a permanent memorial to him here in the Scott Polar Research Institute. I think memorials are important, especially where there's no grave. It gives families a point of closure. Besides the 2-part Antarctic monument, we have created a memorial in St Paul's.
The memorial in St Paul's Cathedral is to commemorate the Britons who lost their lives in Antarctica, increasing our knowledge of that beautiful and terrifying place. The memorial is amongst other memorials to ordinary men and women who did extraordinary things. Nelson, Wellington, Florence Nightingale, and Captain Scott and his companions who died over a century ago on their return from the South Pole.
It's very unusual for a designer to be involved in a project like this, but this particular one was the bringing together of several clients, if you like, to create quite a complex brief. Of course, there was the trust where we wanted to express the nature and the reason for this monument. St. Paul's required it to last 500 years, to withstand multiple fingerprints, and to be educational in some way. To do that, we chose black slate, Welsh slate, to represent the Black Sea, which surrounds the Antarctic, and the land by white marble, which tells you about Antarctic snow covered in a Black Sea. But to add a touch of humanity, we added the penguins. Now, these represent life on Antarctica.
Being asked to carve a memorial in St. Paul's is a great honour, and not without its challenges. Most of all, the accuracy was fundamental. Translating Graham's design onto a riven, rough texture was very difficult. And other elements, like the penguins, were challenging, but in a way, Welsh slate was perfect because as you carve slate, the marks you make are white. And so we were able to create a contrast to illustrate the penguins without having to have too high a relief. The inscription around the edge was also a challenge because when laying out an inscription in a circle, you get all kinds of spacing problems. But I think we got there.
The British Antarctic Survey has a long history of working in Antarctica. And I always think about the conditions that those early scientists must have worked in. There were no maps, and they had to face some very challenging conditions in places that were unknown and unexplored. So we're really happy to support the work of the Trust and transport the memorial to the Falkland Islands.
You know, after having been in the Antarctic twice, I got the opportunity to come down here again to one of the places I'd completely missed on all of this, and I'd read quite a lot about it in the books that I have. And that was to go to where Shackleton crossed the mountain into Grytviken. And I really wanted to go there to see his grave. That was what compelled me to go on the trip. But also, I think the whole idea of this behind this trip about going to the Antarctic and recognizing the Fids that died down here was a brilliant one from Rod.
After a day and a half at sea, we reached the Falklands. We enter through the Narrows into Stanley Harbour, and we have time to look around the town, visit the battle sites, have tea with the governor, and then everybody goes to the dedication in the afternoon. Thank you so much for coming along to this dedication of the southern part of the Antarctic monument. It's a great pleasure to see so many familiar faces and new faces, to see people who have served in the Antarctic, their friends, their relations, and many Falkland Islanders have come this afternoon. We're gathered here to remember those Britons who died in British Antarctic territory in order to increase our scientific knowledge of that extraordinarily beautiful and, to many, terrifying continent, Antarctica.
For me as the governor here, but also as the Commissioner for South Georgia and formerly the Commissioner for the British Antarctic Territory, this is really a very special occasion. And the first thing I'd like to say is to pay tribute to all the members of the British Antarctic Memorial Trust for this fantastic project that they've been working on for many years and are bringing to fruition today. So perhaps I could ask everyone just to give a round of applause to the Trust members. The Falklands is the gateway to Antarctica, and this memorial is, amongst other things, a reminder of this fact. So an enormous thank you to the Trust for bringing this monument to Stanley.
For the British Antarctic Monument Trust, this is the final step in completing the aims which the trustees set out many years ago. We set out to honour those 29 souls, including my brother, who gave their lives in pursuit of science to benefit us all. This sculpture, on which are inscribed the names, inclines with its head slightly bowed towards the narrows, through which they all left, 29 of them, never to return. They remain in the frozen wastes, more than half of them in unknown resting places, and locations which are impossible for families and friends to visit. I know from my own experience this makes it difficult to achieve any kind of closure on the loss of a loved one. We are now able to repeat those words which Rudyard Kipling took from the Bible at the end of the First World War. Their names liveth for evermore.
At some point, we'd like to unveil this before we dedicate it.
And so, to the glory of God, and in humble thanksgiving for those we commemorate, we dedicate this monument in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. And the Lord bless you and watch over you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord look kindly on you and give you peace. And the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit be upon you and remain with you always. Amen.
Thank you very much. And thank you again very much for coming. Thank you.
It's a fantastic thing, and I think it's really brilliant for the Falkland Islands and Stanley that we have this monument here. And it really does, I think, stamp that part of Falkland Islands history, which is our connection to the Deep South and Antarctica and all that history of polar exploration and polar science. So it's here, it's very visible, it's very striking, and I think it's going to just tell that story.
Before leaving Stanley, we pay our tributes to 2 sailors lost on HMS Protector.
I remember the military funeral for these 2 lads. I was a 13-year-old at the time, and I'm not sure if I should have been here, but my mates and I on our bicycles were on the ridge behind and actually watched this all happening, and it really was quite a procession. As a young lad, we didn't really know what had happened. We had heard there'd been an accident on the Protector whilst they were doing seismic work, but that was all we really knew.
After the emotion of Stanley, we spend 2.5 days corkscrewing through the ocean to South Georgia. We visit Right Whale Bay before going on to the former whaling station at Grytviken. We're welcomed at the government offices and research laboratories at King Edward Point. And then we gather at the grave of Ernest Shackleton. I suppose he was one of the greatest leaders in peacetime, in exploration and in scientific endeavour. He looked after his men, he filled their stomachs, as we heard the other day, and he led them. And so I'd like to call upon all of you to drink a toast to the boss. To the boss! And to Frank Wild, who joined him only last year, I believe, and his ashes were returned here to be beside him. Here's to Frank Wild. The following day we leave Grytviken and sail to St Andrews Bay. With its rich wildlife, seals, seabirds, and thousands of king penguins. As we sail from South Georgia towards Sydney Island, we're at our closest to Halley Bay in the Weddell Sea. I'm going to say a little about Neville Mann, who died before I got to Halley Bay, but we were very aware of his death. He was really quite an exceptional character from what I read. He played an instrument, he had his own jazz band, he acted in the plays, he was a sportsman. He was an all-time good guy. There is a memorial or monument at Halley Bay to Neville. I was a surveyor down at Halley Bay beginning in 1965, and this photograph is us after a 30-day journey to the mountains and before we split up to explore the Tottenfjella. On the far right is Dr. John Wilson, who died. Stepping forward just about in the middle is Jerry Bailey, Brian's brother, and two to the left is Di Wild, almost certainly with a pipe in his mouth. If he hasn't got a pipe in his mouth, he probably dropped it. I was sharing a tent with Di Wild and got to know him. He was a happy man. He was doing what he wanted to do. He was brought up in St Athaf's in North Wales. His parents were climbers, mountaineers, and he was a part of the mountain rescue team. And he only wore one shirt and one pair of trousers the whole of the 2 years, as far as I can make out, because he had this huge bag of really fresh stuff that he was going to take back to North Wales so that he would have all this fresh Antarctic gear to go up and down mountains looking after climbers who've got into difficulty. And over the top of the International Harvester, you can see the rig that Jerry was using to measure where the rocks were under the snow, this ice depth radar that he worked on. And they were traveling rather late in the evening. There was snow running across the surface, and unfortunately the cab ran into a crevasse and went backwards down the crevasse. So it was about 10 days before we got back to the scene of the accident, which you can see there. There was little we could do. We made a cross and said a service and read something from the Bible. And you can see there the cross, and just behind it is that little white line, and that's the crevasse that did it all. It wasn't in a crevassed area. It was just seemingly one random crevasse in the middle of emptiness, really. It was a very, very bad stroke of luck. Well, there's Jerry. This is a famous photograph of him, of course, which Brian found in the pictures that came back. I think there was one emperor penguin down to greet the boat. There was only one, and this is it. And of course, the caption is that he was asking the way to the South Pole, and the penguin's pointing the way to the South Pole.
I prefer where's the gents?
Jerry I was very friendly with. He was witty. He was up for a laugh all the time, but really very serious. He'd been in the Arctic with the Americans on this ice depth radar and was a really coming expert. It was a new technology, very exciting to be able to follow what the continent looked like so far below the ice. Also, Dr. John Wilson, here he is in his study. John was quieter. He went down for a year, but volunteered for a second year because he wanted to get out of the base and to see the mountains. Lovely guy, great smile, good companion. But he had a little experiment where you stuffed your hand into a refrigerator and tried to put nails into little holes. And you had to see how many you could do without your whole of your hand freezing off. I think he took real pleasure out of that. Moving forward to Miles Moseley. This is a photograph near Stonington. Are you in this photograph, Bob?
Okay, Miles was base commander of Halley Bay in 1980, and he was killed in a freak plane accident. He was killed immediately, and there's a colleague of his who was very badly injured, but was actually pulled through by amazing work by the doc on the base, who's Steve Smith. I knew Miles about 10 years earlier when I and Miles and Mount MacArthur were based on Stonington Island with about a dozen other people. This was a picture taken on our way south to our summer field trips. Miles is on the left. There's a guy now with grey hair on the right, myself, and in the middle is Drummy Small, who was sledging with Malcolm. Now, Miles was sledging with me for the 4-month period. We were alone together for 4 months. The GA, General Assistant, the sledging companion of a geologist, had to make a map. Now, not all the GAs could do this very well. Miles was outstanding. Miles understood the technique very quickly. He got the hang of it very quickly, and he produced a really good map, which was not only reliable, but it was beautiful. But he's also a really good sledging companion. I mean, you're alone for 4 months with this guy, and he was just extremely considerate. Geologists sometimes are not considerate. We would spend too long doing something, and we'd insist on going back and looking something again, and generally driving our companions nuts. But Miles took it all in his stride, and I'm just extremely grateful for what he did there. So thanks to Miles for his work for all of us that year as Doggy Man. And thanks to Miles for me personally for being such a great guy and making a great map. Thank you.
Several factors have conspired against us such that we now have not been able to get into Cygni Island. Cygni's notoriously difficult to get into. It's often beset by bad weather, but also moving brash ice. And what's happened on this occasion is we've had brash ice moving up from the south with a southerly wind, not only blocking or even getting round the side of Cygni Island, but meaning that even if we did get to Cygni Island, we probably then could not put small boats into the water. And in fact, our decision to not go has been vindicated by the fact that we've now actually had to go round in a circle, and the ship has actually had to reverse its track. And we're having to head even further northwards before we can head westwards again because of all this sea ice we have behind us.
As we pass Cygni Island, Fergus O'Gorman speaks about the loss of Roger Feiler.
Next to me on the left, with the glasses on, is Roger Feiler. Roger, of course, died in 1961, February 1961. Roger came down as a Met man, but had a degree in zoology, and I introduced him to bird ringing and so on. And we both were on a ledge at Gurley, and I said that there were sheet bills obviously there, and I said, let's not do those, because in fact the ledge was covered in poo. That was my last summer season. I went out in April, and Roger stayed on. And unfortunately, the following year, I think that's where he fell off, but I don't actually know that. But they found him dead at the bottom of the cliff, and he's buried there.
We spend another day at sea on our way to Hope Bay.
There was a terrible accident at Hope Bay on the 9th of November 1948.
At Hope Bay at that time, there were 7 on base. The base leader was Frank Elliott, and Frank and 3 of his colleagues were 85 miles away from the base. And on base was Lieutenant Oliver Bird, who was a meteorologist, Michael Green, who was a geologist, and Bill Sladen, who was the medical officer. Bill was also studying penguins and was camping a short way away from the base, watching penguins. And he realised one night that there was smoke coming from the base. And he dashed back to the hut, which was well on fire. He tried to rescue the 2 boys. He couldn't get in and had to concede that they had died.
Frank Elliott and his party returned to the base 16 days after the fire to find Bill Sladen alone by his tent, carrying on with his study.
We couldn't get into Sydney a couple of days ago because of the ice, and now things aren't looking very good off Hope Bay. Monica calls everybody into the lounge and speaks to us from the bridge. We're not going to be able to get in. Too much ice. Everybody is bitterly disappointed. But she says there'll be hot chocolate and cachaça served, and I hope that that'll raise everybody's spirits.
We continue south through the Noirmare Channel to Port Lockroy. This was the first permanent scientific base to be set up in Antarctica. It was established by the British in 1944 in Operation Tabarin.
Look, penguins up there.
Okay, this is it. This is where I used to work, if you can call it work. We also used to relax in here. This beastie used to be a good 2 feet further back maybe 3 feet further back. And I used to sit in front of that stove. So we used to get film out of here, and we'd do the analysis on the table in the mess. If this thing failed, we had to fix it. It was pretty reliable. It's all tubes, but I beg pardon, valves. But it used to run pretty good. And then we used the tape recorder to record the whistlers. What we had to do there was we had to time that tape recorder to switch on very accurately to less than 1/10 of a second. So we had a digital clock, a very early version of a digital clock. And we used to synchronize the clock to WWV on the radio so that we got things to within, we were supposed to be within less than 1/10 of a second. And we could get the timing good, depending on radio reception. Sometimes the reception was really terrible and you couldn't hear the clock. It's kind of interesting looking at it from a historical perspective. Let's face it, I haven't seen this thing for 55 years, so a good deal of nostalgia here. And there's the anemometer that tells you how fast the wind is going. And when it got to 100 knots, which is off scale, the lino would be leaping up in the air. We had fun.
I'd like to present this to you, Sarah, on behalf of the British Antarctic Monument Trust, to celebrate our visit here, to commemorate those that lost their lives in the peninsula area, and to thank you very much for your hospitality.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure for us to be able to... It's a great pleasure to be able to welcome you ashore today, and for all of you to be able to come and see the hut means a lot to us, and to hear all your stories, it's a real pleasure. So thank you so much, and that's something that the future teams will cherish as well. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank
indeed.
you, guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We sail further south, through the truly spectacular Lemaire Channel, towards Petermann Island.
The hut you can see behind me is a refuge hut on Petermann Island, the scene of a tragedy in 1976. 3 Vids, John Cole, who was a diesel mechanic, Kevin Ockleton, who was a physicist, and Ambrose Morgan, a radio operator, were having a jolly away from Faraday Base, which is a little further down. It's in the middle of July they left, crossing the sea ice with a sledge full of supplies. They were due to be away about a week. So happened that after they crossed onto the island, there was a terrible storm which broke up the sea ice. They were then marooned on the island and lived in this hut. There were plenty of supplies of fuel and food, so there wasn't any immediate worry. They were anxious to get back, and the sea ice started to form again. And it is assumed that as the sea ice formed, the 3 guys tried to get back. Unfortunately, they were never seen again.
3 FIDs from Faraday were on a relaxation excursion to climb Mount Peary. Jeff Hargreaves, who was a Met physicist, this was a picture that was given to us from his local newspaper of him leaving home. The other 2 guys were Graham Whitfield, who was a physicist, and Mike Walker, who was the cook. They climbed Mount Peary, which was a peak fairly near there. They were well prepared, good mountaineers, and they successfully reached the summit. Unfortunately, the weather broke and radio contact was lost. But after several missed radio schedules, there was some concern and a search party set out. Also, there was a flight from Rotherham, and they found signs of a severe avalanche. And it can only be assumed that they died in that avalanche, but their bodies were never found.
We land at Horseshoe Island to visit the historic base now maintained by the United Kingdom Antarctic Heritage Trust.
A little way south of here, John Knoll and Tom Allen lost their lives in June 1966 near Stonington. They were traveling with dogs on a 10-day recce and were caught in a terrific blizzard. Although they couldn't get up their tent, they dug a snow hole, but they didn't survive. They were found many days later. One of them was on the surface of the snow, and the other was half in and half out of the snow hole. Some of the dogs had not survived. That was in May 1966. Late in May 1958, 3 men set out from this hut here in Horseshoe Bay across the sea ice 37 miles towards the Dion Islands to do some work with the penguins, who of course are hatching their eggs and looking after their fledglings at this deepest part of the winter. And a couple of days later, they noticed that the sea ice has been swept out, and it seemed as if the men were lost. However, there was hope on base that they would be on one of the islands or on one of the rocks, and so a great search party set out. And then a couple of days later, the first dogs came back, and the dogs had had their leads cut so that they could escape back, and about half the dogs got back. But in the end, after many days' search, it was suspended. And Stanley Black, David Statham, and Geoffrey Stride were lost.
We sail to the British Antarctic Survey Research Station at Rotherham. HMS Protector is anchored in the bay, allowing us to berth alongside. Whilst we're there, a Basler Douglas DC-3 lands on its way to relieve Halley Station, 1,000 miles to the southeast on the far side of the Weddell Sea.
On the afternoon of Saturday, the 16th of May, 1981, I and my friends and colleagues were sitting in the bar at Rothera, waiting for our Saturday evening dinner. Mark Lewis, the base commander, came in and said, "There has been an accident on the Shambles Glacier and John and Bob are dead." You can't imagine the shock that I and the others felt. In the 34 years that have passed since then, I have often thought of this place and that place just over there where they were killed. In those 34 years, music has become an important part of my life, and I'd now like to play a short piece and dedicate it to the memory of John and Bob.
In July 2003, 29-year-old Kirsty Brown was swimming in the waters over here in her marine biology project. She was attacked by a leopard seal which dragged her under the water and drowned her. This memorial was placed here in her memory, and Kirsty Island, over there, was named after her.
Kirsty was just, and I know it might seem a bit of a cliche because of the tragedy that happened to her, but she was one of those personalities that once you'd met her, even for a brief moment, you'd never forget her. She was such a bubbly, just absolutely gorgeous young girl. So even after all these years, it's quite hard to think she's gone.
This beautiful quilt was made by Judith, Kirsty's mother, and sent down to the people on station, and it's still here all this time later, and it serves as a wonderful memory of Kirsty, even for those of us that didn't know her. It makes us think about her and all the other people down here who have sadly lost their lives, and it's a beautiful thing. It's very much loved by all on station.
Dave, as you know, this is a visit inspired by the British Antarctic Monument Trust to remember those who perished in the Antarctic, and as a commemoration we'd like to present you with this plaque.
Oh, excellent, thank you very much.
And just to remember our visit here.
Oh, brilliant, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much indeed.
And just a quick one, we'll make sure this goes up in a prominent place on base, so thank you very much.
Don't forget to give them the screws.
The screws? Screws as well.
Excellent, thank you very much indeed.
Despite the imminent threat of severe weather, we go further south towards a historic base at Stonington. It was near here that John Knoll and Tom Allen, who we spoke about earlier, died in a blizzard. With the storm threatening, we head to the far north of the peninsula to take shelter in the caldera of Deception Island. Here we remember those who died at Deception and close by at Admiralty Bay, King George Island. Eric Platt was a geologist. He died a day after the catastrophic fire that we talked about earlier. And he died of a heart attack. He was a base leader at Admiralty Bay. And in Fuchs's book, it says that he was in the field with Jack Reed, 9th of November 1948. They're approaching a pass in the mountains, and although Jack Reed tried to carry him back to the base, he found it impossible and returned to base to find a search party already heading out to find them. By the time they'd climbed back to the pass, Garrett had died. Greatly distressed, they carried him back, and he was buried near the base.
In 1951, Arthur Farrant came to serve at Admiralty Bay and at Deception Island. He was a diesel generator mechanic, and he had a lot of trouble with the diesel generators. He was older than most FIDs, being late 30s, early 40s, and somehow didn't seem to fit in, and he was very frustrated with the fact that, being a perfectionist, he couldn't get the results he wanted from his work with the generators. He asked for replacements which unfortunately weren't forthcoming. And he had a lot of criticism from the FIDs, and it got on top of him. He couldn't mix with the rest of the people. He became a loner, and in the end, he took what he could see was the only way out, and he shot himself. He was a victim of the Antarctic as much as any of the others, and we honour his memory. He was buried in the Whalers Cemetery just over there. Unfortunately, it was destroyed by a volcanic eruption in the 1960s. But we remember Arthur as well as we remember any of the others.
Also Ronald Napier, General Assistant. He was a carpenter. He died the 24th of March 1956 at Admiralty Bay. You can see there's a cross there, and also a place named after him, Napier Rock, in King George Island. There's a fine-looking man, and we have some examples of his work here that we found, and the hut that he built. He died, in fact, rather tragically, getting into a small boat after being on the John Biscoe at night. And I think 4 got into the dinghy to go back to the base, and Ron went over the side and probably was struck over the head, so just simply couldn't survive, and he was drowned and lost. His body was never recovered. And here's a rather recent photograph of the crosses at Admiralty Bay.
My big brother, Dennis Bell, Tink, or Tinkle as he was also known, was killed at Admiralty Bay, July 59, just a few days after his 25th birthday. It seems he fell into a crevasse and was being brought up to the top, and very nearly at the top, I gather, when the belt he had got round his waist broke, and down he went forever. This is a trip that makes a final closure for me, I guess, and perhaps for many others. I will certainly remember him as a very funny chap, good company, clever, and so thanks to Bass, and in particular to Rod and Brian. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David.
Alan and Tink came down on the Shackleton, as I did in 1957. Seems a long time ago, and yet it is very fresh in my memory. As was said about Tink, he was a great character. And Alan was a very warm-hearted, intense young fella who had just done his national service and was a keen bird watcher. So that as I was the biologist, I put him to work doing bird observations on the way down, and we kept a daily record all the way. It took us several months. HMS Protector came and flew us out from Livingston to Deception. I spent three weeks here while Alan went on to Admiralty Bay, and within a month he was dead. Surviving anywhere is difficult. In the Antarctic, it's particularly difficult. Alan was out walking with one other Fid and a husky, and they went over a 10-foot ice cliff, and Alan hit his head off a rock and died. So, I mean, the most innocent of activities can kill you, as we all know. Only a month later, a little more than a month later, Tink died on Admiralty Bay. So they had 2 deaths within 6 weeks of one another, which for those of us who were down there was an enormous strain. And these 2 lovely young men were dead.
All Fids leave part of themselves in the Antarctic when it is their time to go home. So, in a very real sense, the souls of those who rest here for eternity are never, ever truly alone. They are an integral part of who we are today, and whilst we may grow old and memories fade, they remain forever young and forever in our hearts. And I now call for a minute's silence. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being part of this voyage of remembrance.
As we sail out through the bellows shortly, the captain is going to sound 5 blasts on the horn, 1 for each of those we have just remembered.
I'm just so happy that we've had such a good time. It's been absolutely marvelous to see the colors and to see the mountains in a different way than I had seen them before, and particularly on a 3-week trip, and also to get to Grytviken. And there were some other places we just didn't have the ease to get into, but we saw them from afar.
I think my abiding memory of health and safety was when we gathered at Cambridge for a week's induction before we came to the Antarctic, and a lecture given by Bunny Fuchs, who was then the director of BAS, who went through the, I suppose, 15 or so deaths that had occurred up to 1967, pointing out that in each case some basic safety rule hadn't been followed, and that all the deaths were unnecessary. It was quite a lecture.
Well, I think when we came down, we were relatively undertrained for what we were actually expected to do, though most of the time we'd hoped that there wouldn't be a great deal to do because we were dealing with young, fit men. But we didn't have a great deal of trauma experience, at least I didn't. And there were times on base you felt you really need to be a specialist surgeon, physician, psychiatrist, and even anaesthetist. We had a number of things. We weren't really told how to deal with an evacuation if that should happen, and basically we learnt the process when it actually needed to be done.
There was never any suggestion that we were worried about survival. We were young, 22, invincible, like most young men think they are.
Of all the comrades that e'er I had, I am sorry for their going away, and all the sweethearts that e'er I had, I would wish them one more day to stay. But since it falls unto my lot that I should rise and you should not, I'll gently rise and I'll softly call. Good night and joy be with you.